go ahead and start the class, and people, hopefully this is more of a, maybe a little bit of application or idea, because we're going to move on beyond the sacrifices. We talked about those the last 2 weeks. And so we want to focus on some other things in Leviticus. It's not just about sacrifices. It's how to be holy in a community and how God sees that. And so we'll look at a few things like that. The key verse for me is to understand Exodus 34, 6 and 7, where God speaks to Moses and tells him, I am a compassionate, gracious, forgiving God, merciful, and all the things that went with that. But will not withhold judgment. There would be judgment to the third and fourth generations. But the forgiveness part, or the merciful part, goes to thousands. So it's kind of an interesting contrast there in Exodus 34. And it's important for us to understand that as we read through Leviticus, because this is who God is, and this is how he's applying it to how he wants people to live a holy life in his presence in the tabernacle, which is in the middle of the camp, which we've talked about. If you haven't got that paper, I've got some more up here. So as a few people are still wanting to have a word of prayer. Father, we're grateful for our time together, thankful for the day you've given to us, your creation and all its beauty and all its power. We're thankful, Father, for your love through us, through your Son, and through the guidance and strength we receive in serving you. In Jesus' name, amen. Okay, one of the problems people have with Leviticus is, what's it got to do with anything? Especially as Christians. And so there's some difficulties involved in this. People will look at Leviticus and say, well, it's in the Old Testament. We're going to push that out of the way. We don't want anything to do with it. Sacrifices, well, we understand that part. We know Jesus is the perfect sacrifice. So we'll pass that. But there's some practical applications that we see in there. And yet, how to be consistent, and I don't know whether there's a way to be consistent in it. Struggle. And so we're going to look at some things real briefly. And again, we only have 4 weeks and we can't get into a lot of detail, but we'll look at a few things here. And one of the things that brings this up is I was watching one of my favorite movies, which is Fiddler on the Roof. There's a lot of things I could say about it, but I really enjoyed watching it the other day, considering we're studying Leviticus and some of the things that were going on there, the traditions that are involved in Russia at the turn from around 1900. Sort of that's where the background is. The beginnings of the Russian Revolution, the Jews being cast out of Russia, and the turmoil that's going on, the poverty, and all the things that go, but yet the traditions of the marriage, the matchmaker, some of the things that Tevye does in his talking with God, which is really fascinating to me. And yet, in another way, how he tricks his wife to get his first daughter married to the guy that she wants to marry. So it's all kind of an interesting little movie. And a lot of people look at this Jewish-Christian differences and how do we deal with it? And one of the ways I've been thinking about it is in Acts 15 and verse 20. When Paul and Barnabas come back from their missionary journey and they're discussing with the elders in Jerusalem and the church there, because there's complaints, Pharisees saying that Christians were saying that the Gentiles should be circumcised and follow the law of Moses. And so they have this long discussion, and the realization is that the Jews couldn't live under it. Why should we force the Gentiles to live under it? And so now what do we do? And this is throughout history. How do we look then at the law or the Leviticus or some of the things that are found there? And I read two Jewish scholars, historians, talking about the first 4 centuries of Christianity and the Jewish-Christian relationship. And it's a mixed bag, and it's also very complicated. One said there were numerous Christian sects, but most people considered Christianity, or those who followed Jesus, Jewish. Makes sense. Jesus was Jewish. And then how they had the same problem. You look at Acts 15, we look at Romans, there were conflicts there. How do all this fit together? How does all this work out? And so the historians basically said, and sometimes it was they were in conflict with each other. There was a battle between them. Asia Minor in Acts 13 and 14, and Greece in Acts 16 and 17, you see some of that conflict. But then there were times where Christians would be involved with their Jewish friends. They would go to the synagogues. They would go and participate in the Passover, which I found kind of interesting. And that's into the 4th century before that ceased. And then there were some people who used some very negative and horrible things that have led to a lot of other negative and horrible things against the Jews in particular over the centuries. So it's an ongoing struggle. How should we live as Gentiles, and how should Jews live as Jews? Should they follow Leviticus or reject it? Should we follow Leviticus and reject it? Well, there's where the conflict is. There's where the discussion is, and you hear a lot about it today. So if we read Acts 15, verse 20, this is what they decided. And they would send a letter out that the Gentiles needed to stay away from idols. That's found in Leviticus. And they did stay away from blood, basically drinking blood. And we talked about life is in the blood, it belongs to God. Doesn't belong to anybody else, it belongs to God. And we looked at, you can look at Leviticus 17 and some other texts. Strangled meat, and the reason for that is the blood is still in the meat. The blood had to be poured out completely. And then sexual immorality, there's a couple of chapters on that. So those are some of the struggles. As Christians, then, we can read through Leviticus, recognize the restrictions. These are things we shouldn't be doing. Learn some lessons from those. And the things that are different, the things that are, love your neighbor. We don't have a problem with that. Treat everyone the same. Love your neighbor, love the stranger, love the widow, treat them all right. We can talk about that. We can, the aliens, they were aliens. We can look at that and say, yeah, we can do those types of things. So there's things we can do. There's things we can look at and say, yeah, I can understand that. I can work with that. And there's some things that obviously the sacrifices bring a different perspective. And so those are some things we'll look at this week. And next week we're going to look at one chapter. That's going to be an interesting chapter to discuss concerning how we see God. Chapter 10 is where we'll start. This is one of those interesting chapters probably familiar with. Just spend a few minutes here. Nadab and Abihu offer strange incense, and fire comes from heaven and burns them up. God says this, among proved holy in the sight of all people I will be honored. Holiness, honored. We've talked about the shame and the culture there of being holy, be honored, honor, shame, culture. If you shame yourself, you shame God, or if you shame God, you're unholy. And so this is what they did in offering whatever the strange incense was, or added incense, or however your translation reads. Several things come to mind are offered as ideas of that. What they were doing again One, that they may have been drunk, not a good idea, but, and that's found near the end, or around verse 8 to 10, and some other verses in there. Verse 9, fermented drink. Verse distinguish between the holy and the common. So whatever the incense was, it meant a common thing rather than a special set aside type of thing. So God is letting them know there's a way to live in his presence. And he's not going to tolerate some things. And this is just a warning. It's an ugly warning. We don't like it. Why would our loving God do that? But it's a warning. There are just some things that we have to understand. And we can say God is love, and that's true. And that's why he's compassionate and gracious. But there's still times where there's penalty to be paid. Now God can extend that. You think about this takes place approximately 1200 BC. They don't go into Babylonian captivity till 600 BC, 800 years. He tolerated a lot of stuff in 800 years. Now, there were periods of judging, there were periods of people coming and narrowing the kingdom and various things happening, but God didn't tolerate some of that stuff. So, anyway, that's just one idea. There's clean and unclean food. Mentioned that, or mentioned clean and unclean animals. And so, not sure what that means, how that distinction is made by God. One suggestion is that the unclean were the bottom feeders, catfish and so forth, and the vultures and things like that. So they ate meat with blood in it. Also, some of the animals were the carnivores, and so that may be one of them. But if you're a medical doctor, you'll look at it a different way and say, well, these animals have these diseases, and not like a pig. You don't cook a pig right, you're going to get real sick. And if you read Acts 12, one of the Herods there may have died because he ate bad pork. But that's just some speculation there. But that being the case, if you're going to cook pork, cook it well. And then, now, if a Jewish fellow, if you're going to have a Jewish friend over, or a Messianic Jewish friend, don't offer him pork. I know what Jesus says, I know what Acts says, but if they're going to maintain their particular position as maybe kosher, that's okay. We can let them have that kosher lifestyle, and we can join them in that lifestyle in the sense of, I don't have to eat pork every time I have a guest over. I don't have to violate their scruples, as it were, for my pleasure. I want to do what I can to welcome them, and meals are so important. You brought that up last Saturday. Meals are so important in Scripture, and so important in relationships. We sometimes just think, a meal is a nice thing to do. We don't necessarily always have that closeness in meals. But if you go to the Middle East, when we were in Jordan, we stayed at a place where, I don't know how to describe it. It was a bunch of, it was supposed to be camping out at 3,000 feet in February in 30-degree weather at night. So we were in this metal building. They had heaters that didn't help. It didn't never get warm. It was ice cold in those things. But we had a meal in there. The fellow that was running it invited us to sit with dinner. He had cooked the meal, and we sat. We asked some questions. He talked about his life, places he went. We ate the food. It was delicious. Everything was really good. And we were, and they go all out. It's like a 9-course meal in 3 courses. You get the on
Traditional.
the first part of it, the sort of the salad, we get the hummus and other things, and you eat that. Well, by the time you finish eating that, you're full. And they say, okay, now we're going to bring out the meal. You know, and that comes out, and it's like food all over the place. And you finish that and say, oh, that's okay. And so we had they take that meal seriously. He did not have to spend any time with us, but he sat down with his guests, and he spent time with us, discussing and talking, and that's the way they do things in the Middle East. And in many other places, meals are very important, a form of extreme fellowship. And I'm going to use that term because we have fellowship, but you know, ours, we don't go to that extent at times. And that's maybe something we're missing in how we do things. So anyway, that's something we see in the clean and unclean food. So for us, we don't have a problem eating catfish. I think most people like catfish. I never ate catfish. And so, you know, I never ate out to England, so just go figure that out one too. But anyway, you know, that's okay. We eat catfish and we can have shrimp and things like that. But if a person who's a Jewish person decides I can't eat that, well, you don't feed them that. You know, accept what he enjoys, and because we want to be in fellowship and in relationship in these things. Part of that comes from a little a sermon I heard way back when in Virginia at a workshop called "Speak Tenderly to Jerusalem." This fellow worked in the World Trade Center, and he had started a ministry in there. And his goal was, how can I to people who are different? He concluded that the best way to do it, I become a Jew to a Jew. That is, you know, again, if they're kosher, I'm going to be kosher. If they have certain things they do or certain ways they do things, like maybe the way they say a prayer, and again, if you watch Fiddler on the Roof, there's a scene around the table at a Sabbath, and it's very interesting and very traditional, and you watch that, you get kind of the picture. Well, if they do that, I can do that. They're not violating anything there. Because I will become a Jew to a Jew. Now, I've heard that before, becoming a Jew to a Jew and becoming a Greek to a Greek. That's like 1 Corinthians, if you go looking there. Become all things to all men that might say some, 1 Corinthians 9. So I have a friend now traveling in Africa, a classmate of mine. He was a missionary there for 27 years, so he's been sending pictures back, the places he's going back and seeing, and people he knew and encouraging. And he was in Tanzania, and they had all these bowls on the ground. That was the table. And he said, yes, there are bowls on the ground. And yes, this is what's in them. It didn't sound like he was too excited about that. But in fellowship, he sat down and ate with him. So that's how, you know, when we say dinner on the grounds, we have tables. When they say dinner on the grounds, they really mean it. Dinner on the grounds. You know, that's how they did that. That's how they do things. When I was here's another one. And we can all bring up these stories in England. This was way before COVID back. You know, when the British ruled the world and all. The first congregation I attended there that was English, of course, they're doing the Lord's Supper. And they passed the bread, okay, typical, no problem. And then they had 2 cups. 1 cup on that side and 1 cup on this side. And they started from the front, and everybody took a sip until it got to the back. That's the reaction I'm looking for. Oh, that doesn't sound too good. You want to be up front. That's one way to get people up front, by the way. You want to be among the first and not the last. But that's the way they did it. Now, do you run in there and say, "Oh, this is unhealthy"? Well, today that because of the COVID situation and all that. But back then, that was just the way they did it. And if we go back in our own history, our own family history, we may say, we did some crazy things too. I mean, we had some interesting ways we put food together and ate. So we see that in the eating of, in the clean and unclean animals. You can make your decision. If you don't like shrimp, you don't have to eat shrimp. I like almost everything. There's some things I'm not crazy about. A few things I have not tried. Lime green seaweed was one of them in the Philippines. Just couldn't get past the lime green. But, I will try most anything. And we'll see how that works out. Chapter 18, and again, I'm just highlighting some things here. We don't have a lot of time to go verse by verse. This is a list of the sexual immorality. Now remember, just consider in Acts 15, when this letter went out to all these churches, you know what their Bible was, don't you? Their Bible was the Old Testament. So they would go looking, okay, abstain from sexual immorality. Well, what does he mean by that? Well, one place you go is Leviticus 19, or 18. Go to Leviticus 18, you read all those sexual sins there. These are the things you're going to stay away from. And part of that is because of the chaos it brings. And we know that. We know that those types of sins bring chaos to society. They bring chaos to a home, and they bring chaos to life. We know that. We know that we have to have that self-control, our commitment to our spouses, our standard of how we live before others. Otherwise, society becomes chaotic. And when society becomes chaotic, it starts to fall apart. And that's what happened. And if you read verse 24, do not defile yourselves in any of these ways, because this is how the nations that I'm going to drive out before you became defiled. Even the land was defiled. So I punished it, the land, for its sin, and the land vomited out its inhabitants. So that's, and he repeats that in verse 27 and 28. And then in verse 30, keep my requirements, do not follow any of the detestable customs that were practiced before you came, and do not defile yourselves with them. I am the Lord your God. And that phrase, especially in the last half of Leviticus, becomes very prominent. I am the Lord your God. He'll say that often because he's reminding them, this is how I want you to live in my presence. We might say, well, for us, we would say, no problem. Others would look at that and say, that's terrible, that's ridiculous. But when you don't have a standard to live by, then you live in chaos. And that's the chaotic world.
But in the world is that way now. Society is chaotic.
Yeah.
And it's nothing wrong with if two people consent to having sex, that's perfectly fine in society.
Yeah, that's right.
We don't look at it that way, but society is that way still.
Yeah, that's why it applies to today. I mean, you can read this text and say, look what's happening in the world. You're right. And we see it all over the place. It just it pops up, unintentionally pops up everywhere. So what do we do? You may have a favorite TV program, but you start looking, rarely do you see somebody who has been married and the spouses, they've been married and they've been together for life. That's rare. It's always, girlfriend, boyfriend, whatever. Various laws in 19. Feel free to make comments, because or you can get it, don't it early. It depends on how fast you want it. This is probably the chapter where you will look at it and say, well, yes or no, like 19:1, be holy because I, the Lord your God, am holy. But then he goes through some things. He does repeat some of the Ten Commandments. Verse 11, verse 10 says, I am the Lord your God. Do not steal, do not lie, do not deceive one another, do not swear falsely by my name, and so profane the name of the Lord. Do not defraud or rob your neighbor. Do not hold back the wages of a hired worker overnight. Do not curse to death or put stumbling block in front of the blind. But fear your God, I am the Lord. You think they had problems like we do? Right? Has that much changed in human life? Human nature? I mean, we look through history and we see it. I think sometimes we think we're the only ones, that ever do this, who've ever done something bad or something good. And in reality, that's not true. This was an issue in the world of Moses. And you have people wandering through the desert, and you have some blind person, and somebody just lets them go wander off. Lord's not happy with that. That's not what it's about.
I was watching a soccer game, and when the ball went out of bounds, whatever they call it,
Yeah.
one of the guys in the stand picked the ball up, put it behind the border, and hit the ball. Like, that's normal. Like, in that culture, you know what I mean?
Well, you don't know soccer.
I know I don't, but at the same time, I know that's wrong. You don't do that. So doing that in their mind is like, I wasn't trained. I wasn't raised right enough to know that's wrong.
The issue, well, there's a lot of issues, but it's the desire to win, but you forget. The guy in the middle of the field has a watch, and if you're going to delay the game, he doesn't have a problem saying, we'll play this till midnight if we have to. So it doesn't normally happen. Basically, somebody would get a red card and that take care of it. Or they throw them out. That's side notes. But it's just, or you think of football. We'll throw the ball up in the stands and try to delay time. The referee can go like this, stop the clock and wait till we get a football.
Well, that's where morals come in.
Yeah, but there's also a lack of self-control now in sports, and that's all over. So those are some other things. Let's see. Do not pervert justice. Do not show partiality to the poor or favoritism to the great or rich, but judge your neighbor fairly. Do not go out spreading slander. If you're reading through 19, we're seeing this. This is just the way life is. We're not justifying it. This is the way we live in a society. How do we live differently? How do we separate ourselves? We're to be holy. Why? Because the Lord is holy. I am your God. I am holy. Be holy. And those are the types of things that we can live. There are other things, and we'll talk about this one only because, we'll talk about it. 28. Do not cut your bodies for the dead or put tattoo marks on yourselves. I am the Lord. Okay. Again, is that a bad thing to do? Well, it depends on what you're doing it for. If you're becoming a member of the gang, and you put on a tattoo, you're basically worshiping the gang. Now, there's other texts that talk about having God's name written on you. So there's kind of a little bit of a contrast there. So why you're doing it. But anything good can be turned into bad. Anything positive can be turned to negative. I have seen some of these gang members when I've been in the prisons visiting. And some of them, let's face it, we're going to meet people who have tattoos from one end to the other, head to toe, on their face. But if they're a Christian, what are you going to do? You have to accept them. Because I am your Lord, I am your God, I am holy, be holy. This is how you're to be holy. Now we don't run out and do things, but we are going to be holy, and holy says love your neighbor. Treat the foreigner, like verse 33. When the foreigner resides among you in your land, Do not mistreat them. The foreigner residing among you must be treated as your native born. Love them as yourself, for you were foreigners in Egypt. I am the Lord your God. Don't use do not use dishonest standards with scales and all that. Keep all my decrees and all my laws and follow them. I am the Lord. So there's these ideas that are being expressed in these texts. You can read through and decide, well, I'm not going to get a tattoo, but if somebody I know gets a tattoo, that's fine. You know, why did they get it? I'm not going to argue that point. That's an optional thing. That's what makes it difficult. What's optional, what's not. These are the things we need to be concerned about. These four. No idols, no blood, no strangled meat, no sexual immorality. That's the ones we have to be concerned about. The others, take it, you don't have to celebrate Passover as Gentiles. We don't have to celebrate Passover. But if we're invited to and you want to, that's fine. Because in Leviticus it says, or in the Torah it does say, a foreigner can participate in it. Now, yes, be prepared for it.
Yeah, Mr. My question is, and I can't recall where it comes from in the word, but I know it says that you shouldn't, the word laceration comes to mind, but, getting piercings.
Yeah, well, that was, yeah. Oh, well, there is the idea of, there's two. This text says don't cut yourselves. There is a problem, surprisingly, not, especially, this is several years ago, of young girls cutting their wrists and cutting their arm, there's a thing that is involved in that. That has to be dealt with. That's not something that's a positive thing.
Right.
But there is a piercing that you pierce your ear with this is a servant who wants to stay with his master.
Correct.
So there's that.
Not a ritual like when you're 5 years old, you want to go ahead.
No,
and
right.
He's
making his choice at his age.
So
Yes.
that's the thing.
So, and there's some background to that, but yeah, that's involved in that. So there's just different things to look at, and we can decide. And we don't have to make a hard and fast rules. That's the first thing. We don't have to make hard and fast rules. If you don't want to do it, you don't have to do it. If you don't want to eat pork, you don't have to eat pork. But if you want to eat pork, keep that in mind. Now, I don't know if there's any Jewish Christians in here, but you may look at it a little differently. You may say, well, I know my brothers and sisters like pork. And so if I'm sitting there with them and they're eating pork, I'm not going to eat pork, but I'm going to let them do it and just let them enjoy it. Obviously, Jesus said all food is clean. Peter in Acts 10, divisions, all the clean and unclean. God said, don't call something unclean that I've made clean. So food is one of those things. We have to obviously study the scriptures, realize that the New Testament is looking through the Old Testament eyes. And again, these are the four things we have to be concerned with. Those are the four. I watched a movie last night, The Magnificent Seven, the last one. One with Denzel, how do you say, Denzel Washington? I can get his name. And in one of the scenes, this Indian or Native American was carrying a deer, and in order to be acceptable, the Indian offers him a piece of the raw deer, and he takes a bite. But that's what it would, I thought. The first thing that came to my mind is, this one. First thing that came to my mind, you gotta. But that's just a subtle way of a movie, and he's a Christian, so I don't know. You kind of have to think about that, but it's a subtle way of saying, hey, this may be okay. And I know people like rare meat, which is maybe fine. And I don't mind, medium well or medium. I don't want blood rolling out of it. But then again, you go back to that text. So there's things we have to ask ourselves. does this fit into these categories? And look at what the scriptures say. So, let's see if there's, chapter 20 is some punishments that involve sin. There are being cast out of the assembly or the out of the community, that is, out into the wilderness, or facing death. So you can read through that. Chapter 22, there's also unacceptable sacrifices, the types of animals you're to offer. And again, it concludes with, I am the Lord. Let's see. I must be acknowledged as holy by the Israelites. I am you holy, and who brought you out of Egypt to be your God? I am the Lord. So these are some of the things that are involved in how to live in the presence of God, in the holiness of God. That the thing that I gave about, if you haven't got one, I've got some, but this is what it looks like if you're roughly tribes on the outside, tabernacle in the middle. This is all holy, holy ground. Anything that was unholy or common would have to be done outside the camp. Well, this is all holy, the whole thing. And if you're unclean, you had to become clean, and then you could approach the tabernacle. And that's sort of the way, or that's the way we need to think about living, that we are holy people. But our holiness is not limited to a campsite or a tabernacle that's surrounded by tribes. It's how we live our life everywhere. That's the fun part, but it's also the difficult part. How can I be holy? Driving down 1960 and you get cut off. You know, is that the way we, is that what we wanted? Well, I was just trying to, express my opinion. Or were we really? Had we thought maybe he was in a hurry to get to the hospital because his wife was sick? We can, more than likely he was speeding because he was impatient. But, we can come up with all kinds of things. Funny story, we were in Tennessee with Darnell and Yvette were in the back seat of the car. I was driving, her dad was sitting next to us. And he normally didn't say much when he drove, or because I've driven with a number of times, and he usually when we drove around he didn't say anything. But we were going to a Mexican restaurant, all things. We were driving down the road, and this car pulled out in front, about 2 blocks away. And the next thing, what was the word he used?
Said, "You idiot."
Not just you idiot, came out of his mouth like, what? They're cracking up in the back seat. They are dying laughing back there. I'm driving trying not to laugh. But people will come up and say, oh, wait a minute, where did that come from? It was, now, it's funny because it was said within, but is that, we need to think about sometimes, are we getting maybe too over, affected by the way things are done in society, where we're not thinking about. First thing is the car was nowhere near hitting us. It had plenty of time to get out, and I didn't have to put on the brakes or anything. So, the perspective there was way off. And are we just getting frustrated with society? And there's some ideas of that as well. And so you do a lot of driving, you start to see things, and you wonder. Of course, the warning here is, well, we think about Sean Richardson. Don't go through a green light until you check both ways, because you never know when you're going to get T-boned. So those are things that we have to be careful with. One real fast thing in chapter 24, 10 and following of blasphemers is put to death. The son of an Israelite mother, the Egyptian father, went out among the Israelites, and a fight broke out in the camp. The son of the Israelite woman blasphemed the name with a curse, so they brought him to Moses. They inquired of God, and God said for them to stone him because he blasphemed his name. Now, I'm sure, looking at that background, and there's a lot more involved, the Egyptian, how did this Egyptian father see what was going on here? Or was he even there? Maybe a little bit of a problem of mixed marriage, maybe difficulties in how even the Israelites saw God. We already know the golden calf has happened. So how were they, accepting of all kinds of other idolatry? Carrying idols out there in the wilderness. There's an example. There's somewhere there that's mentioned that they had put away their idols. So they're carrying their idols with them, some of them. So it's an interesting situation. Camp has to be holy, and God takes His name seriously. And so there's those types of examples. Anyway, that's some highlights. Next week we're going to look at chapter 26. It's a challenging chapter of describing who God is. Does anybody have any comments or questions they want to make? Go ahead.
My brain is thinking that, approaching God is not a game. Approaching God
Right.
is real and authentic. And the whole purpose of the law was to lead us to Christ.
Mhm.
And what we do matters, our actions.
Yeah.
Towards Him matter. It's that important. It's that important.
Yeah, and again, going back to Fiddler on the Roof, we do have our traditions. And there's some good traditions, some good things that we do. And I want, we think about the Lord's Supper. We often take it thinking about His death and all that that means. But there's also the focus, the idea of we've come together as a and how does that reflect on things? And should we be joyous at that time? And one sister commented, well, aren't we supposed to be joyous? Would it be wrong to say cheers, to the congregation, lift it up and cheers? I may go with Wachheim, because it means to life. And that's what God is about, life. The blood is about life. The people was about life. This is how you have life. This is how I want you to have life. This is how life is meaningful. And sometimes we look at it as, oh, this is a burden, or this is hard to do. And that's not what it's about. It's about living and enjoying being in the presence of God. The Passover was celebrated. It wasn't yeah, they did tell the stories, and they talked about, they repeated the stories, and obviously there were some serious things in there, but one of the things they concluded was next year in Jerusalem. That's how they looked to it. Oh, we look forward. Just like the Lord's Supper. We could say next year in the new heavens and the new earth. Or next week in the new heavens and the new earth. It's life. And sometimes we miss the life. Even in reading Leviticus, we're missing, God isn't giving us things to weigh us down. He's giving us life. And that's how you read it. So, all right, go ahead.
One important distinction that I always make is that's Israel. We are learning, He never gave that to us. That anything in that whole, the law and the prophets was never given to Christians. It was given to Israel.
Okay.
And then what do we learn from what, even Paul said that wasn't, when he said that wasn't written to us, he was talking about him and the people that he was talking to in Rome at the time. So he said, but it's given for our learning. So a lot of times we read though it was written to us.
Right.
And that's a good way to get confused, because we were never told anything about stay away from pork or any of that. That was never taught to us. Gentiles wasn't even given the oracles of God. They didn't have them at all. And when Gentiles were ever offered salvation and became a part of the commonwealth or a part of the promise, it was through Jesus. So we never learned any of that through Jesus. And we were never obligated to go in Jewish history and learn how to live. That was never a thing then, and it's not now. And a lot of times, I don't know, sometimes it seems like
Well,
we read it and hear it and say, oh, that's,
but
we should-
we did say it was, for our learning.
yeah,
So there are things to learn there.
yeah, there are things, yeah. Yes.
And, I think it's important for us to go back.
Oh, yeah.
I think it's important, I think sometimes we need to realize the Psalms and the prophets have something more to say than just what the law said. So there's, but yeah, interesting, it's a good point. That, which makes all this study fun.
Yeah.
Because we have all, you know, how do we look at these things and read them, and then how can we explore further, so. But obviously, Paul and Jesus and all the writers of the New Testament, their scriptures were the Old Testament, so
Right.
that's where they were getting
Right.
their material from. Maybe it's something we need to think about as well, get our material from there as well.
Yeah, anytime he said scriptures, he was talking about
Yeah,
the law and the prophets, not what he was writing.
right. All right, there's the bell.
All right.